The Galactic Council had existed for over 9,000 years. It was the oldest institution in known space, older than most civilizations that now sat within its chambers. 46 species sent their representatives there. They debated trade routes and border agreements and the slow, grinding machinery of interstellar law. And for all of those 9,000 years, the Council had been protected by rotating honor guards drawn from the member species. Every race took its turn. Every race contributed soldiers to stand at the doors and along the walls and at the base of the great speaking platform. It was considered a mark of trust. No single species had ever been given permanent watch over the chambers. That was the tradition. That was the rule. Jake Morrison did not care much about traditions or rules. He was 26 years old, a corporal in the United Earth Marine Corps, and he had been standing at the far door of Council Chamber 9 for the last 4 hours without moving. His dress uniform was stiff and uncomfortable. His boots were too new and pinched at the heel. He had been told 3 separate times that his role was purely ceremonial, that Earth's probationary membership in the Council meant he was there to look professional and do absolutely nothing else. He understood the assignment. He just was not very good at doing nothing. The session that afternoon was a routine trade summit. 12 delegations had gathered around the long curved table to discuss shipping tariffs through the Rethon corridor. It was, by every measure, the most boring event Jake had ever been forced to attend, and he had once sat through a 9-hour briefing on supply chain logistics at Camp Pendleton. The delegates spoke in measured tones. Their translators hummed softly. The 2 Salathi guards standing at the main entrance looked half asleep, their tall silver frames perfectly still, their wide dark eyes blinking in slow rhythm. Jake watched everything. He watched the way the Delvari Prime Speaker folded her long fingers when she was annoyed. He watched the Mavari delegate shift in his water chair when the discussion turned to fuel taxes. He watched the Craythani ambassador, a broad-shouldered figure named Zorvan, sit perfectly still for the first 2 hours, and then begin tapping one claw against the underside of the table in a pattern that did not match any nervous habit Jake had ever seen. It matched a countdown. Jake did not realize he had noticed this. His conscious mind was still bored, still sore in the feet, still thinking about the coffee he had been promised after his shift. But somewhere deeper, in the old wiring that human beings carried from 1,000 generations of watching dark tree lines for predators, something had locked on to Zorvan and had not let go. The moment came at the 4-hour mark. The Delvari Prime Speaker rose to present a revised clause. She stood at the edge of the table, her back partially turned to Zorvan. And Zorvan moved. He was fast. Jake would give him that. The Craythani were a heavy species, thick-limbed and powerful, but Zorvan came out of his seat with a speed that said he had been planning this for a long time. A plasma blade appeared in his hand, pulled from somewhere inside his formal robes, and it glowed a bright and terrible blue as he lunged across the table toward the Prime Speaker. The Silathi guards at the main door saw it happen. Their eyes went wide, their bodies locked. It was not cowardice. Jake would learn later that the Silathi processed threat responses through a consensus-driven neural loop, a biological system that required their brain to hold an internal debate before it allowed violent action. It was an elegant system. It had kept their species peaceful for 10,000 years. It also took nearly 4 seconds to complete. 4 seconds was a very long time when someone was about to die. Jake moved. He did not decide to move. There was no thought, no calculation, no moment where he weighed the politics of a probationary species interfering in a council matter. His legs pushed off the stone floor and he ran. 14 meters of open space between the far door and the table. He covered it in just under 2 seconds. His boots, the ones that had been pinching his heels all afternoon, hit the floor in hard, sharp beats that echoed through the silent chamber like gunfire. Zorvan was almost there. The blade was close enough to catch the light reflecting off the Prime Speaker's robe. She had only just begun to turn, her expression shifting from confusion to the very first edge of fear. Jake hit Zorvan from the side. It was not graceful. It was not a technique from any manual. It was 200 pounds of human being launched at full sprint into a moving target. They crashed together and went down hard, sliding across the polished stone floor in a tangle of limbs and formal cloth. Jake got his hand around Zorvan's wrist and twisted. The plasma blade skittered away across the floor, spinning blue light across the ceiling. Jake locked his arm around Zorvan's neck and pressed him flat against the ground, one knee in the center of his back, both hands controlling the arms. Zorvan thrashed, once, twice, and then stopped. He was strong, but Jake had leverage and weight distribution and the kind of desperate grip that comes from a body flooded with adrenaline. Jake's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. His vision had narrowed to a tight, bright tunnel. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and loud, and underneath it the strange high-pitched whine that Zorvan was making, something between rage and pain. The chamber was silent. 12 delegations sat frozen around the table. The Silathi guards had finally begun to move, their long limbs unfolding with cautious speed, but they stopped when they saw that it was already over. The Delvhari Prime Speaker stood with one hand pressed to her chest, her wide silver eyes locked on the young human who was kneeling on her attacker's back and breathing like he had just run a marathon. A fine cut ran along the outer edge of her robe. The blade had come that close. Jake looked up. Every face in the room was staring at him. He suddenly became very aware that he had just tackled a senior ambassador from a major galactic power in the middle of a formal council session, and that he was a corporal, and that his orders had been very specifically to stand at the door and do nothing. "Sorry," he said, because he could not think of anything else. No one answered. The silence stretched on, filled with the soft hum of translators trying, and failing, to find the right context for the word. In the observation gallery above the chamber, Counselor Idrimis Vel leaned forward in his seat. He was Paylori, old beyond easy counting, and he had served on the Council's Security Committee for over 200 years. He had seen assassinations before. He had seen them succeed, and he had seen them fail. He had never seen anyone move that fast. He watched the footage 17 times that evening, slowing it down frame by frame. The human's reaction time, from the moment Zorvan began to move to the moment Jake's feet left the ground, was 0.19 seconds. The fastest response the Silathi guards had managed was 3.7 seconds. The gap was not a difference in training, it was a difference in kind. Idrimis Vel closed the footage and sat in his dark office for a long time. Then he opened a formal request to the Council's Security Committee. He did not request an inquiry into the assassination attempt. He requested an inquiry into the human. They came for Jake 3 days after the incident. 2 Paylori officials in pale gray robes appeared at the door of his quarters on the station's lower ring and informed him, through a translator that made their voices sound like wind chimes, that his presence was requested before the Council's Security Committee. They were polite. They were also clearly not asking. Jake put on his dress uniform again, the boots still pinched. Commander Lisa Grant met him outside the hearing room. She was Earth's newly appointed liaison officer to the Galactic Council, a 41-year-old naval officer with short brown hair and a reputation for staying calm in situations that made other people shout. She looked calm now, but Jake had served under enough officers to recognize the particular stillness that meant someone was furious and holding it behind their teeth. "You are not in trouble," she said as they walked down the corridor. "Officially." "And unofficially?" Jake asked. "Unofficially, you tackled a Crethani ambassador in front of 12 delegations, and the entire Security Council is trying to figure out what to do with you." She glanced at him. "So just answer their questions, be honest, and try not to shrug." Apparently the translator turns it into something rude in Delvhari. The hearing room was large and round, with a curved table that held 11 representatives from 11 different species. Jake had never seen so many alien faces pointed in his direction at the same time. He was given a seat in the center of the room, a low chair designed for a species with shorter legs. So he sat with his knees awkwardly high and his hands folded in his lap, and tried to look like a professional soldier and not a man sitting in a child's chair. Counselor Adramus Vel sat at the head of the table. He was old. That was the first thing anyone noticed about him. His skin had the pale, almost translucent quality that Pelori developed after their 3rd century, and his eyes were deep-set and dark and missed absolutely nothing. He opened the hearing with a brief statement that this was not a disciplinary proceeding, but a fact-finding inquiry, and then he asked Jake to describe what had happened in the chamber. Jake described it. He kept it simple. He saw the ambassador move. He saw the blade. He ran. He made the tackle. He held the pin until the other guards arrived. Vel nodded slowly, and then asked the question that Jake had not expected. At what point did you decide to act? Jake thought about it. I don't think I decided, he said. I just moved. A murmur passed through the panel. The Salathi representative leaned forward and asked through a translator whether Jake's species had some form of precognitive ability. Lisa Grant, standing behind Jake, closed her eyes briefly. No, Jake said. We just react fast. That answer opened a door that the committee spent the next 2 weeks walking through. They brought in biologists, military scientists, and neural researchers from 6 different species. They ran tests, they compared data, and what they found, piece by piece, unsettled nearly everyone in the room. They started with reaction time. The average human combat response, from stimulus to physical action, was roughly a quarter of a second. The Torvan, who were considered the finest warriors in council space, averaged 1.1 seconds. The Salathi averaged 3.5. Most other species fell somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds. The gap was enormous. It was not a matter of training or technology. It was built into the wiring. The committee's lead biologist, a Fendral named Torath, explained it in terms the panel could understand. Most species in the galaxy processed danger through their higher reasoning centers first. They saw a threat. They analyzed it. They considered options. And then they acted. It was logical. It was efficient. It was slow. Humans had a different system. They had a small structure deep in their brain called the amygdala, and it could hijack the entire body before the conscious mind even knew what was happening. The signal went from the eyes to the amygdala to the muscles, skipping thought entirely. By the time a human realized they were in danger, their body was already responding. Torath described it as a short circuit. Their brain cheats, he said, and the room went very quiet. Then they tested pain tolerance. Jake agreed to a voluntary endurance demonstration. He was asked to hold his hand over a thermal plate that increased in temperature by small degrees. The plate was calibrated to the tolerance levels of 12 different species. Jake held his hand in place well past the mark where most species pulled away. He held it past the Torvan limit. He held it past the point where the Pylori medical examiner, a gentle woman named Saral, asked him to please stop because the readings were making her uncomfortable. He finally pulled his hand back and flexed his fingers a few times. How would you describe the pain? Saral asked. It hurt a decent amount, Jake said. The translator rendered this phrase 6 different ways for 6 different species, and none of them quite captured the casual tone in which it was delivered. Saral stared at him for a long moment, and then made a note on her screen that simply read, abnormal. The adrenaline tests were worse. Under controlled stress conditions, Jake's body released a cascade of chemicals that temporarily increased his speed, strength, and resistance to pain and shock. His heart rate climbed, his pupils dilated, his muscles received more blood and more oxygen. He became, for a brief window, measurably more dangerous than he was at rest. The Salathi biologist on the panel, a researcher named Vetha, watched the data come in and sat back in her chair as if someone had pushed her. She called it a temporary controlled evolution. She asked to take a short break and left the room. She came back 20 minutes later and asked Jake whether all humans could do this. Jake said yes. She left the room again. The final round of testing covered endurance and vigilance. The committee wanted to know how long a human could remain alert and ready for combat without chemical assistance. Jake told them about a training exercise where he had pulled a 30-hour watch rotation without sleep. He told them about the time his squad had marched 40 miles in full gear through desert heat and then run a live fire exercise at the end of it. He told these stories the way a person might describe a long day at work, with a shrug and a vague sense of annoyance. The panel did not know what to do with any of this. They were not afraid of Jake. He was, by all accounts, a pleasant young man who followed orders and liked coffee, and sent messages home to his mother on Tuesdays. But the data was the data. He was faster, tougher, more pain-resistant, and more durable than any guard from any species the Council had ever employed. And he was, by his own account, an average human. But it was the last question that changed things. It came from Counselor Vell, who had been sitting quietly through most of the proceedings, watching Jake with those deep old eyes. "Corporal Morrison," he said, "when you saw the ambassador moving toward the Prime Speaker, you did not know her. You had never spoken to her. She is not of your species, not of your world, and her survival offers no strategic benefit to Earth's position in this council. Why did you act?" Jake was quiet for a moment. He looked at Vell, and then at the table of 11 faces, and then down at his hands. "She was in danger," he said. "I was closer." The translators hummed. The room was still. Vell studied Jake's face for a long time, looking for something. Politics, ambition, performance. He found nothing but a young man who seemed genuinely confused about why the question needed to be asked at all. Vell made his second note of the inquiry. The first had been about speed. This one was about something else entirely. He wrote a single word in his own language, a word that did not translate well into any human tongue. The closest meaning was something like the instinct that makes a creature stand between danger and a stranger without being asked. The recommendation landed like a stone dropped into still water. The Security Committee, led by Counselor Idramis Vell, proposed that the Galactic Council install a permanent human guard detail inside the council chambers. Not a rotation, not a shared posting, a permanent, exclusively human force responsible for the physical safety of every delegate, ambassador, and counselor who set foot in the most powerful room in the galaxy. The ripples spread fast. Ambassador Dreth Solon of the Crethani delegation was the first to speak against it, which surprised no one. His own people had just been humiliated by the assassination attempt, and the idea that humans, a species that had been part of the council for less than a single year, would now stand armed in the chambers where his ancestors had debated law for 3,000 years, was, in his words, an insult wrapped in a suggestion. He made his case before the full assembly. He was a good speaker. He stood at the center of the floor with his heavy arms folded across his chest, and his deep voice carrying to every corner of the gallery, and he reminded the council of exactly what humanity was. "They are a young species," he said. "They have been in space for less than 2 centuries. Before that, they spent most of their history killing each other. They split their own world into territories and fought over lines drawn on maps. They built weapons capable of burning their entire planet to ash, and then pointed those weapons at each other. They conquered the weaker among them and called it progress. They are effective, I will grant you that. They are effective in the way a plasma fire is effective at clearing a forest. But you do not invite the fire to guard your home." It was a strong argument, and it found support. The Mavari delegation, a deep ocean species that had always found humans physically unsettling, agreed that placing an aggressive land-dwelling species in a permanent security role raised serious concerns. The Fendral, whose culture prized consensus and restraint above all else, worried about the message it would send, that the Council valued combat ability over diplomatic balance. Even some of Earth's tentative allies among the smaller delegations voiced quiet concern in private meetings. Humanity was too new, too unknown, too dangerous. Commander Lisa Grant watched the opposition build from her small office on the station's diplomatic level. She had expected pushback. She had not expected it to come from so many directions at once. She sat at her desk and read the position papers and the formal objections and the anonymous opinion pieces circulating through the Council's internal network. And she felt the careful, fragile progress that Earth had made over the past year begin to crack at the edges. She called Sergeant Nate Holloway to her office. Nate was Jake's squad leader, a 38-year-old Marine with 17 years of service, 2 combat tours, and a face that looked like it had been carved from rough stone and then left out in the weather. He was big. He was scarred. He spoke in short, blunt sentences and had a handshake that once made a Torvan officer wince. He was, in almost every way, exactly the kind of human that the galaxy was afraid of. "We have a problem," Lisa said. "I heard," Nate said. "They think we're animals, efficient animals, but animals. If this vote fails, it's not just about the guard posting. It sets the tone for Earth's entire membership. We stay on the outside." Nate sat down across from her. The chair was too small for him, just like every chair on this station was too small for him. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need them to see what I see," Lisa said. "I need them to understand that being dangerous and being a danger are not the same thing." Nate thought about this for a moment, then he stood up and left without saying anything else, which was very much his way. Over the next 2 weeks, while the political debate raged through committee rooms and back channels and formal assemblies, Nate Holloway did something that no one on the council expected. He made himself visible. Not in the aggressive way that the Krathani feared, and not in the stiff ceremonial way that the council was used to seeing from human soldiers. He simply showed up. He visited the medical ward where 2 delegates had been treated for minor injuries during the incident. He brought nothing with him, and asked for nothing. He sat with a Delvari aide, who was recovering from shock, and talked to her about the flowers on her homeworld, which he had looked up the night before on the station's database. His pronunciation of the Delvari flower names was terrible. The aide corrected him gently, and he tried again, and she almost smiled. He learned the Delvari greeting of peace, a complex gesture involving both hands and a slight bow that carried deep cultural meaning, and he performed it for the prime speaker when he saw her in the corridor one morning. He did it wrong. His hands were in the wrong position, and his bow was too deep, making it look more like an apology than a greeting. The prime speaker stopped walking and looked at him with an expression that might have been surprise or amusement or something softer. And she corrected his hand position and told him to try again. He did. It was still wrong, but less wrong, and she touched his arm briefly before continuing down the corridor. He ate in the common dining hall instead of the human section, trying foods from other worlds and making faces at the ones that tasted bad, which was most of them. A group of young Pelori staffers began sitting near him at meals, curious about this large, quiet human who chewed slowly and said little but seemed to notice everything. And then there was the Salathi aide. Her name was something that human vocal cords could not properly produce, so Nate called her Sil, and she did not correct him. She was young by Salathi standards, barely past her second maturation, and she had been in the chamber during the attack. She had seen the blade, she had seen the blood on the prime speaker's robe, and she had frozen, as her biology demanded, and she carried the shame of that stillness like a wound. Nate found her sitting alone in an observation lounge on the station's upper ring, staring out at the stars with the blank, distant expression that he recognized from young soldiers after their first firefight. He sat down next to her. He did not speak. She did not look at him. They sat like that for nearly half an hour. They only sound the faint hum of the station systems and the occasional murmur of people passing in the corridor outside. Finally, Sil spoke. Her translator rendered her words in a thin, wavering voice. "I could not move," she said. "I was supposed to protect them, and I could not move." Nate nodded. "I know," he said. "Your corporal moved." "Yes," she said. "Why could he move, and I could not?" Nate was quiet for a while. He looked out at the stars, and then back at Syl, and he chose his words with the kind of care that people who knew him well would have recognized as rare. "Because we are built different," he said. "Not better. Different. Your people think before they act. That is not a weakness. That is what makes your species wise. It is what kept your civilization alive for 10,000 years without a single civil war. My people act before they think. Sometimes that saves lives. Sometimes it ends them. We are lucky when it goes the right way. Your people are wise enough to not need luck." Syl looked at him. Her wide, dark eyes, the same silver-black as deep water, studied his face. "You are not what I expected," she said. "Nobody ever is," Nate said. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not leave until she told him she was all right. When she finally stood and walked toward the door, she paused and said, "Thank you for staying." "That's what we do," Nate said. 3 days later, the Council Security Committee called Syl as a witness. She was asked to describe her experience during the attack, and her interactions with the human personnel afterward. She spoke clearly and steadily, and when she reached the part about Nate, she said something that the translators carried to every ear in the room. "He just stayed," she said. "He asked nothing. He wanted nothing. He simply stayed until I was no longer afraid." In the gallery above the hearing room, Counselor Idramis Vel made a small mark on his notes. He had been keeping a list. On one side were the arguments against the human guard detail, the political risks, the historical concerns, the fear. On the other side was a shorter list, growing slowly, of moments that could not be measured by any test or simulation. He looked at the 2 columns and thought about what it meant to trust someone with your life. The trial was designed by the Torvon Military Academy, and the Torvon did not believe in making things easy. They had spent 3 centuries building the most respected combat training program in Council space, and when Counselor Vel asked them to design a test that would determine which species was best suited to guard the Council chambers, they took it as both an honor and a challenge. The simulation they built was, by every account, the most rigorous security exercise ever conducted in the history of the Galactic Council. The scenario was straightforward. A replica of Council Chamber 9 was constructed in one of the station's lower cargo bays, complete with a curved delegate table, observation galleries, entry points, and holographic delegates seated in their proper positions. Combat drones would enter the chamber through randomized access points and attempt to reach the delegates. The guard team's job was to stop them. Speed, accuracy, coordination, and delegate safety would all be measured. Every second would be recorded. Every movement would be tracked. 8 teams entered the trial. Each was composed of 4 guards from a single species. The Torvon sent their best. The Fendral sent an elite defensive unit. The Salathi, despite the shadow of the incident, insisted on participating. 2 Krathani teams entered, eager to prove that their species was more than the actions of one rogue ambassador. The Mavari sent an underwater combat squad adapted for land operations. A Pelori team entered out of principle, though no one expected them to perform well in a combat scenario. And the humans sent their team. Jake Morrison, Nate Holloway, Corporal Katie Marsh, and Private Ben Cortez. They were the youngest team in the trial, by a significant margin. They had the least experience in galactic operations. They had never trained with alien combat drones, never worked in a replica council chamber, and never operated under the observation of 46 species at once. They were also the only team that laughed during the briefing. The Torvon training master, a tall and heavily muscled officer named Gareth, delivered the briefing in a clipped, precise voice that left no room for questions. He described the drone types, the attack patterns, the scoring system, and the consequences of delegate casualties. It was professional. When he finished, Katie Marsh leaned over to Ben Cortez and whispered something that made Ben snort so hard he had to cover his mouth with his hand. Gareth stared at them. He did not understand what was funny. Neither did anyone else in the room. The trials began the next morning. The Torvan went first, because it was their simulation and they were not shy about confidence. Their team moved with practiced precision. 4 soldiers working in perfect formation, covering angles and closing distances with the mechanical efficiency that had made the Torvan the gold standard of galactic security for 300 years. The drones entered from 2 points. The Torvan neutralized all threats in 4.2 seconds. 0 delegate casualties. 1 team member took a glancing hit to the shoulder from a stun round. It was an excellent performance, and the gallery responded with the polite equivalent of applause from a dozen different species. The Fendral went next. They were defensive specialists, and their strategy reflected it. They formed a tight barrier around the delegate table and waited for the drones to come to them. It worked well for the primary attack, but when a second wave of drones entered from an unexpected angle, one slipped through the perimeter and reached a holographic delegate before being stopped. It was a minor failure, but in a real scenario, someone would have died. The Salathi team performed with quiet determination. They moved slowly, deliberately, their long limbs reaching and covering with a grace that was almost beautiful. But when the drones attacked, the old problem returned. There was a pause, a hesitation, a gap between seeing the threat and responding to it. It was shorter than before. Their training had helped, but it was still there, coded into their biology like a lock that could never quite be removed. They stopped the drones, but it took 6.1 seconds, and 1 holographic delegate was tagged. No one blamed them. The numbers were simply recorded, and the Salathi team leader stood at attention, with her dark eyes fixed straight ahead, and said nothing. The other teams performed within expected ranges. The Krathani were strong but slow. The Mavari were fast in water and clumsy on land. The Paolori team fought with surprising heart, but lacked the physical tools to compete. And then it was the humans' turn. Jake, Nate, Katie, and Ben walked into the replica chamber with the loose, easy movements of people who were about to do something they had done 1,000 times before. They took their positions, Jake and Nate near the main entry points, Katie along the left wall, Ben near the delegate table. They did not speak. They did not signal. They simply looked at each other once, briefly, and nodded. The drones came. They came fast, faster than the standard attack pattern, because Gareth had quietly increased the difficulty for the later teams to test adaptability. 3 drones entered from 3 different access points at the same time, converging on the delegate table from multiple angles. The humans moved like water. There was no formation, no predetermined pattern, no visible coordination, and yet every movement fit perfectly with every other movement. Jake took the nearest drone with a hard strike to its sensor array, shutting it down in a single motion. Nate intercepted the second at the main door, catching it mid-flight and driving it into the floor with both hands. Katie rolled under the third drone's initial pass, came up behind it, and disabled it with a technique so fast that the Torvan observers in the gallery could not identify what she had done. They asked her to demonstrate it 3 times in slow motion afterward, and even then, Gareth shook his head and muttered something that his translator chose not to render. Total time, 1.7 seconds, 0 delegate casualties, 0 team injuries. The gallery was silent. But it was the final scenario that changed everything. The simulation engineers had built a last round, approved quietly by Counselor Vell and known only to the design team. It was not a standard combat test. It was something else entirely. The drones attacked as before, fast and from multiple points. But this time, in the center of the crossfire zone, between the delegate table and the nearest entry point, a new hologram appeared. A small Paolori youngling, barely 2 feet tall, with wide, frightened eyes and thin arms reaching out in confusion. It was not a threat. It was not part of the combat scenario. It was simply there, small and scared, and standing exactly where the worst of the fighting would happen. The drones came in hard. The other teams, tested earlier in the day under the same surprise variable, had responded in different ways. Most had completed their primary mission, neutralized the threats, and then addressed the child afterward. 2 teams had not noticed the child at all until the simulation ended and the observers pointed it out. No team had treated the child as a priority equal to or greater than the mission objective. The human team split in an instant. There was no discussion. There was no hesitation. The moment the child appeared, the team divided as if they had rehearsed it 100 times, though they had not, because no one had told them the child would be there. Jake and Nate engaged the drones. They moved faster than they had in the first scenario, faster and harder, because now there was something behind them that mattered more than the score. Katie broke formation and ran for the child. She crossed the open space in 3 strides, dropped to her knees, and scooped the small holographic figure into her arms. She pulled it tight against her chest and covered its head with her hand. She curled her body around it, making herself a shield of bone and muscle and intent. Ben positioned himself between Katie and the nearest line of fire. He stood with his back to the drones and his arms spread wide, and took a stun round squarely between his shoulder blades. The impact knocked him forward a step. He planted his foot, steadied himself, and did not move. He stayed exactly where he was, a wall between the danger and the child, until Jake and Nate finished the last drone, and the chamber fell silent. The entire sequence took 2.3 seconds. It was slower than their first run. It was the most remarkable thing anyone in the gallery had ever seen. The observers sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the questions began. A Torvon officer leaned forward and asked Katie why she had broken formation to protect a holographic child that could not actually be harmed. Katie still had the hologram in her arms. She looked down at it, at the small, flickering image of a frightened child that was made of light and nothing else, and then looked back at the officer. "Training doesn't know the difference," she said. "Neither should we." She set the hologram down gently, as if it were real, and stood. In the gallery above, Counselor Idrimus Vel pressed his hands flat against the railing and leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the glass. He had spent 200 years on the security committee. He had watched the finest soldiers in the galaxy perform under every condition imaginable. He had seen bravery and skill and discipline in every form the galaxy had to offer. He had never seen anyone shield a child made of light. He closed his notes. He did not need them anymore. He already knew what his recommendation would be. 6 weeks passed between the trial and the vote. In those 6 weeks, the footage from the simulation spread through every delegation, every committee room, and every corridor on Velori Station. It spread beyond the station, too, carried by diplomatic channels and news feeds to 100 worlds. The clip of Katie Marsh shielding the holographic child was watched more times than any security recording in Council history. Most species did not understand what they were seeing. They watched it again and again, trying to find the calculation behind it, the strategy, the training protocol that would explain why a soldier would break formation and risk her life for something that was not even real. They could not find it, because it was not there. Ambassador Dretz Salon watched the footage too. He watched it alone in his quarters, in the dark, with the sound turned off. He watched Katie run for the child. He watched Ben take the stun round to his back, and refuse to move. He watched Jake and Nate fight harder and faster than they had in the first round, not because the score mattered, but because something behind them mattered more. And he sat with his heavy hands on his knees, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Something that sat uncomfortably between admiration and fear. He did not withdraw his opposition, but when the vote came, he abstained, and for a Crethani ambassador, that was as close to agreement as pride would allow. The vote was held in the full assembly chamber, the largest room on Velori Station, with seating for all 46 delegations and gallery space for staff, observers, and press from across the galaxy. Councillor Idramus Vel presented the motion personally. He stood at the speaking platform, old and straight-backed and steady, and he spoke without notes. He spoke about the 9,000 years of the Council's history. He spoke about the rotating guard tradition and the trust it was meant to represent. He spoke about the assassination attempt and the failure of the existing system to prevent it. He spoke about the data, the reaction times, the pain tolerance, the adrenaline response, the endurance, and he laid it out plainly, without exaggeration, letting the numbers carry their own weight. And then he spoke about something that the numbers could not capture. We have tested their bodies, he said. We have measured their speed and their strength and their ability to endure pain. These things are remarkable, and they are well documented in the committee's report. But I did not call this vote because of their bodies. I called it because of what I saw in the simulation, and what I have seen in the weeks since. He paused and looked out across the chamber, at 46 delegations and 1,000 faces, and the accumulated weight of a civilization that had been governing the stars since before humanity had learned to write. I saw a young woman shield a child made of light, he said. She knew it was not real. She knew there was no life to save. And she held that child against her chest, and covered its head with her hand, and made herself a shield, because something inside her would not allow her to do anything else. I have served on this committee for 214 years. I have watched the finest guards in the galaxy stand their posts with honor and discipline and courage. But I have never seen that. I have never seen a species that protects not because it has been ordered to, not because it has calculated the value of the life in question, but because the act of protecting is woven into the deepest part of what they are. The chamber was very quiet. We have known warriors among the stars, Vel continued. We have known strategists and conquerors and survivors. We have known species that fight for territory, for resources, for dominance, for survival. All of these are rational. All of these are understandable. But in 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, we have never encountered a species that fights because something deep and unrelenting inside them refuses to allow harm to come to those nearby. They do not calculate whether the person is worth saving. They do not consult their chain of command. They do not wait. They move. This is not strategy. This is what they are. He let the silence hold for a long moment. Then he called the vote. The motion passed 33 to 13, with 7 abstentions. It was the widest margin on a security resolution in over 400 years. Council Standing Order 771 was ratified that same day. It declared that from that day forward, the interior guard of the Galactic Council chambers would be composed exclusively of human personnel. The order was not classified as a privilege or an honor. It was classified as a duty, one that the Council formally acknowledged no other species was biologically, psychologically, or instinctively suited to perform. The language was careful. It did not say humans were better. It said they were different, and that this particular difference made them uniquely qualified for this particular task. The ratification ceremony was held the following morning, in the same chamber where the vote had taken place. The gallery was full. Every delegation sent at least one representative, and most sent their full complement. The observation feeds carried the ceremony live to over 100 worlds. Commander Lisa Grant stood at the speaking platform. She wore her dress uniform, pressed and perfect, and her face was calm and composed in the way that people who knew her would recognize as her truest form of pride. She had spent weeks fighting for this moment, arguing in committee rooms, drafting position papers, managing a political storm that had threatened to swallow Earth's entire membership in the Council. She had done it with patience and precision, and the kind of quiet determination that does not make for dramatic stories, but wins wars of attrition every single time. She accepted the duty on behalf of Earth. She thanked the Council. She kept her remarks short, because she knew that the moment was not about words. Behind her, standing in a straight line against the far wall of the chamber, Jake Morrison, Nate Holloway, Katie Marsh, and Ben Cortez stood at attention in full dress uniform. They were the first permanent human guard detail in the history of the Galactic Council. They stood perfectly still, their eyes forward, their hands at their sides, and they looked exactly like what they were, 4 ordinary human beings who had been asked to stand between danger and the people of the galaxy, and who had said yes without hesitation. The delegations began to file out. The ceremony was over. The formal business of the council would resume in the afternoon, and there were meetings to attend, and papers to review, and the slow machinery of interstellar government to maintain. The gallery emptied in the usual order, with the senior delegations leaving first, and the junior members following behind. The Delvari Prime Speaker did not follow the usual order. She waited until the aisle near the wall was clear, and then she walked toward Jake. She was tall and slender, and moved with the careful grace that her species was known for, and her silver eyes were fixed on the young human corporal, who had knocked a knife out of the air, and pinned an assassin to the floor, and then apologized for it. She stopped in front of him. Jake kept his eyes forward, as protocol demanded, but he could see her in his peripheral vision. She was close enough that he could see the fine pattern of scales along her cheekbones, and the way the light caught the edges of her formal robe, which was new, because the old one had been cut by a blade that would have reached her heart. She placed both her hands on his shoulders. It was the highest Delvari gesture of personal gratitude, reserved for those who had placed themselves between a Delvari and death. It was rarely given. In the Prime Speaker's lifetime, she had never given it before. She spoke in her own language. The words were soft and carried a tone that the translator struggled with, cycling through several options before settling on something that captured the meaning, if not the feeling. "You stayed between me and the blade," it said. "I will not forget." Jake looked at her. He opened his mouth, and then closed it again. He had never been good with words, not in English, and certainly not in situations like this, where the weight of the moment pressed down on him like gravity, and he could feel every eye in the room turning toward them. So he said nothing. He simply nodded, once, and the Prime Speaker held his gaze for a moment longer, and something passed between them that did not need language or translation or explanation. She removed her hands from his shoulders, touched the place over her own heart, and walked away. The chamber emptied. The lights dimmed to their standard setting. The curved delegate table hummed softly as its systems powered down for the break between sessions. In a few hours, the room would fill again with ambassadors and counselors and the endless work of governing a galaxy. And at the doors and along the walls and at the base of the speaking platform, humans would stand guard. Jake Morrison returned to his post at the far door. He settled his weight evenly on both feet, straightened his back, and fixed his eyes on the room in front of him. His boots still pinched, but he had stopped noticing. He simply stood guard, and for the first time in 9,000 years, the council chambers felt safe.